Good morning, everyone. Today I would like to introduce the Bank of Scotland. It is one of the most important banks in Scottish history. It was the first bank founded in Scotland, and it is the oldest bank still operating in the country today. Its story began in the 17th century, but it is not only part of the past. The Bank of Scotland is still part of everyday life in modern Scotland. It is also still a very familiar name in British banking. When people speak about Scottish banking, this bank is always mentioned. Its long history helps us understand not only how banking grew in Scotland, but also how Scotland itself changed over time. The bank has lived through political change, industrial change, technological change, and international expansion. It has supported trade, introduced new services, and helped shape modern banking. So when we look at the Bank of Scotland, we are looking at more than a single bank. We are also looking at a small but very important part of Scottish history. The Bank of Scotland was founded on the 17th of July, 1695 by an Act of the Scottish Parliament. That is important, because it shows that the bank was created by law, not simply by a small private group. At that time, Scotland needed a stronger and more stable financial system. Credit was hard to get, cash was limited, and the economy was uncertain. Merchants and landowners needed a safer and more reliable way to borrow money, invest, and support trade. The new bank was created to meet that need. Its purpose was to support Scottish business and strengthen the economy. In that sense, it was founded to solve a real national problem. It was not set up in the same way as the Bank of England, which was closely linked to war finance. Instead, it was meant to support Scottish trade and improve economic life inside the country. From the start, the Bank of Scotland had a practical role. It was there to support business, build confidence, and make economic activity safer and more secure. When the bank was founded, its first shareholders mainly came from Scotland's political and business elite. These were people with influence, money, and a strong interest in the future of Scottish trade. They wanted a banking system that could offer long-term credit and bring more security to business life. The Founding Act also gave the bank several important advantages. It gave the bank a monopoly on public banking in Scotland for 21 years. It allowed the bank to raise a large amount of capital. It also gave shareholders limited liability. That was very important, because it reduced personal risk and encouraged people to invest. At a time when financial institutions were still developing, that kind of legal protection mattered a great deal. The early structure of the bank shows that Scotland was trying to create not just any bank, but a modern institution with clear rules and a serious national purpose. The people behind it were thinking about stability, trust, and economic growth. That helps explain why the Bank of Scotland became important so quickly. The bank opened for business in 1696, and very early on it made an important contribution to the economy. Once its capital had been raised, it was able to offer loans that helped support Scottish businesses. That was especially valuable at a time when credit was often difficult to find. In its early years, the bank also acted as a source of support during difficult periods. For example, when poor harvests caused shortages of food, the bank provided interest-free loans to help buy meal and grain. That tells us something important about the role of banking at that time. The Bank of Scotland was not thinking only about profit. It was also involved in helping society respond to crisis. In an age when financial systems were still developing, that kind of support could make a real difference. It also helped build trust. A bank can only succeed if people believe it is stable, useful, and dependable. By helping both business and wider economic life, the Bank of Scotland established itself early as an institution with real public importance. One of the most famous parts of the bank's history is its role in paper money. In 1696, the Bank of Scotland became the first bank in Europe to issue paper currency successfully on a continuing basis. At that time, coins were often in short supply and could be unreliable, so paper notes brought a major improvement. They made trade easier and helped solve real practical problems in everyday finance. The bank first issued notes in larger amounts, such as 5, 10, 20, 50, and £100, and later added a £1 note as well. This was a major step in banking history. It changed the way people thought about money and payment. It also showed that the bank was willing to try new ideas instead of following only old methods. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that the Bank of Scotland still issues its own banknotes today, under the legal system that allows Scottish banks to do so. That gives it a very special place in financial history. It is not only an old bank. It is also the world's longest continuous issuer of banknotes. The early years were not easy, and the bank faced strong competition. In 1727, the Royal Bank of Scotland was founded, and that began a fierce rivalry. The two banks entered a period often called the Bank Wars, with each side trying to strengthen its own position and weaken the other. This competition was intense, but it also helped make Scottish banking stronger and more active. Over time, competition did not come from only one rival. More banks were founded across the country, and the financial world became more crowded. The Bank of Scotland responded by building its own branch network and extending its reach. In that way, rivalry helped drive growth. The bank had to become more flexible, more visible, and more closely connected to customers in different areas. Competition can create pressure, but it can also encourage improvement. In the case of the Bank of Scotland, it pushed the bank to move beyond its original base and serve a wider Scottish public. That became an important part of its long-term success in a changing market. Another important moment came after the Acts of Union in 1707. Scotland's old coinage had to be reminted into sterling, and the Bank of Scotland played a supervisory role in that process. This was a very important task. Currency is closely connected to trust, trade, and everyday economic life. Managing a change like this required experience and public confidence. The bank also became an important source of stability in the Scottish financial system during later periods of difficulty. In the 18th century, for example, other banking houses collapsed, and that created wider instability. In times like that, institutions such as the Bank of Scotland became even more important in maintaining public confidence. This is one reason the bank's history matters beyond its own customers and offices. Its role was not only to serve its own clients. At key moments, it also helped support the wider Scottish banking system. That kind of institutional importance is one reason why the Bank of Scotland remained central to Scottish banking over many generations. Its reputation was built not only on age, but also on reliability when reliability mattered most. As the bank grew, it also expanded across the country. Its first branches were opened in Dumfries and Kelso in 1774. By 1795, the bank already had 27 branches, and the network kept growing through the 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1860, there were 43 branches, and by 1939 the number had risen to 265. This branch growth tells us a great deal about Scotland's economic development. It shows that banking was no longer limited to a few big cities or wealthy business groups. It was becoming part of ordinary business and local life across the country. Opening branches meant bringing financial services closer to merchants, farmers, families, and communities. It also meant that the Bank of Scotland was learning how to work on a much larger scale. Running a national branch network requires organization, communication, and consistency. So branch growth was not only a sign of size. It was also a sign of stronger capability. The bank was becoming a truly national institution, with a clear presence in many parts of Scotland and closer links with communities far beyond Edinburgh. In the 19th century, the bank also started using new forms of communication. In 1853, it became one of the first Scottish banks to use the electric telegraph service. Today, instant communication feels normal, but in the mid-19th century this was a major advance. The telegraph allowed information to move much faster than before. That helped banks manage transactions, coordinate their branches, and respond more quickly to changing conditions. In a way, it was the 19th century version of email. The decision to use the telegraph shows that the Bank of Scotland was not simply an old institution holding on to old habits. It was often ready to adopt new technology when that technology could improve service and efficiency. This pattern appears again and again in the bank's history. It was old, but it was not inactive. It respected tradition, but it also understood the value of innovation. That balance between continuity and change is one reason why the bank remained relevant for so long. It knew how to preserve trust while also adapting to new ways of working and communicating. The 20th century brought even more change, and once again the Bank of Scotland took an important step forward. In 1959, it became the first bank in the United Kingdom to use a computer for the central processing of accounts. That is a striking achievement, especially when we remember how new and unfamiliar computers were at the time. The first centralized accounting unit served only 4 branches at the beginning, and it took years before all customer accounts were transferred onto the system. Even so, this was a major turning point. It marked the beginning of a new era in banking, when information could be processed more quickly and on a much larger scale. There is also a memorable story from that time. Branch managers were taken to Edinburgh to see the machine, and only a few people were allowed in at once because there were concerns that body heat might affect it. That detail gives us a vivid picture of how unfamiliar the technology seemed. Even so, the bank chose to embrace it and move forward. The bank's efforts to reach customers could also be seen in another way. In 1963, it launched its first fleet of mobile banks. These served rural communities in places such as Bathgate and Haddington, and later the service was extended to northwest Scotland and the Isle of Skye. A floating bank was even introduced to serve parts of Orkney. This is a very human part of the bank's history, because it shows an effort to bring banking directly to people who might otherwise have struggled to reach a branch. Rural communities often face practical barriers, including long distances and limited transport. By using mobile and floating banks, the Bank of Scotland responded to real local needs. It recognized that modern banking was not only about large branch buildings in cities. It was also about service, access, and inclusion. This approach tells us something important about the bank's character. It was not interested only in growth in an abstract sense. It was also trying to make services available in places where traditional branch banking was less convenient. That idea still feels very relevant today. In 1968, the Bank of Scotland introduced ScotCash, which was an early form of the ATM or cash machine. This was another major step in making banking easier and more convenient. These machines worked 24 hours a day, so customers could withdraw cash even when the branch was closed. Customers used personal code numbers, much like today's PINs, and inserted vouchers into the machines to receive cash. The amount was then later debited from their account. By today's standards, the system may sound basic, but at the time it was a very important innovation. It changed the relationship between customers and banks by giving people more independence and more flexibility. They no longer had to depend completely on branch opening hours. By the end of 1971, there were 26 ScotCash machines operating across Scotland, which shows that the idea was both practical and popular. Once again, the Bank of Scotland was not waiting passively for the future. It was helping to build it. Many features of modern everyday banking began with developments like this. The same pattern continued in 1985 with the launch of HOBS, the Home and Office Banking Service. This was the first electronic home banking service in the United Kingdom. Long before internet banking became normal, Bank of Scotland customers could use a television screen and a telephone link to manage their accounts from home. That sounds surprisingly modern, even though the technology was very different from what we use today. HOBS shows how far ahead the bank was thinking. It understood that customers would value convenience and remote access, and it tried to build those ideas into banking before the internet age had really begun. We often think of digital banking as something quite recent, but its roots go back much earlier. The Bank of Scotland was one of the institutions that helped lay those foundations. This matters because it shows that innovation in banking is not always sudden. It often develops through early experiments, practical testing, and gradual changes in customer behavior. HOBS was one of those important early steps toward the digital banking world that people now take for granted. The Bank of Scotland also expanded beyond Scotland. In the later 20th century, especially after the arrival of North Sea oil in the 1970s, the bank developed strong expertise in energy finance. It then used that experience to grow internationally. Its first international office opened in Houston, Texas, and later it opened more offices in the United States, Moscow, and Singapore. The bank also entered overseas markets through acquisitions, including a bank in New Zealand and later expansion into Australia through Bankwest. This international growth shows that the Bank of Scotland was no longer working only as a national institution. It was becoming part of global finance. At the same time, it remained strongly linked with Scotland and especially with Edinburgh. That combination of local identity and international reach is one of the most interesting parts of the bank's story. It shows how a historic Scottish institution was able to operate successfully in a much wider world. Banking is closely connected to trade, investment, and international movement, and the Bank of Scotland adapted to that wider economic reality. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a period of major change in British banking, and the Bank of Scotland was deeply involved in that process. In 1999, it made a bold attempt to take over NatWest, which was a much larger English bank. Although that bid was not successful, it showed ambition and confidence. Then, in 2001, the Bank of Scotland merged with Halifax to form HBOS. This was a major development, because it created one of the largest financial groups in the United Kingdom. Later, in 2009, during the financial crisis, HBOS was acquired by Lloyds TSB, and the new organisation became Lloyds Banking Group. As a result, the Bank of Scotland became part of a much larger banking structure. Even so, it kept its own identity and heritage. This is a good example of how old institutions can change form while still keeping their name and character. Modern banking is shaped by mergers, restructuring, and regulation, but history still matters. In the case of the Bank of Scotland, the name remained powerful even as the corporate structure around it changed in major ways. Today, the Bank of Scotland is based at the Mound in Edinburgh, in one of the city's most recognisable buildings. Its headquarters are not just an office. They are also a visible symbol of the bank's place in Scottish history. The building connects the institution with Edinburgh's identity as a historic centre of finance, law, and public life. The bank now operates as part of Lloyds Banking Group, and it provides both banking and insurance services. In the materials you shared, the bank is described as a commercial and clearing bank. In simple terms, that means it plays an important role in everyday financial activity, including payments and customer banking services. The bank has a large workforce and substantial assets, which shows its scale in the modern financial sector. Yet one of the most interesting things about the Bank of Scotland is that, even as part of a large group, it still has a clear Scottish profile. Its language, branding, note design, and historical associations all reinforce that identity. In this way, it works not only as a business, but also as a lasting symbol of Scotland's financial heritage. One of the best-known features of the Bank of Scotland today is that it still issues its own banknotes. This surprises many visitors, because not every part of the United Kingdom has commercial banks that issue their own notes. In Scotland, some banks still have that right, and the Bank of Scotland is one of them. These notes have the same value as Bank of England notes, but they carry their own Scottish designs and traditions. Over the years, the bank has produced different series of notes. The 1995 Tercentenary series marked the bank's 300th anniversary and included images linked to Scottish industries such as oil, distilling, research, arts, and tourism. A later series focused on Scottish bridges, and the modern polymer notes continue that theme in updated form. Sir Walter Scott appears on the front of the notes, and landmarks such as the Glenfinnan Viaduct and the Forth Bridge also appear. So the notes are not only a way to pay for things. They also act as small cultural objects, carrying national images and historical memory into everyday life. The move from paper notes to polymer notes is another example of how the bank has continued to adapt. The polymer £5 note was launched in 2016, followed by the polymer £10 note in 2017. These notes are more durable, more secure, and cleaner than older paper notes. At the same time, they continue the long Scottish tradition of note design while using newer materials and better security features. In later years, the bank also introduced a polymer £100 note featuring Dr. Flora Murray, a Scottish medical pioneer and suffragette. This is important because it shows that note design can also reflect changing public values. Currency can honor not only buildings and landscapes, but also people whose lives helped shape society. In that sense, banknotes are not just technical products. They also communicate identity, memory, and national pride. The Bank of Scotland's continued role in note issue connects the modern bank directly to its earliest achievements in paper currency. The materials may have changed, and the designs may have evolved, but the tradition itself still continues in a clear and visible way. The Bank of Scotland has also played a role in public and community life beyond ordinary banking. Over the years, it has sponsored Scottish sport, including the Scottish Premier League for a period, and it has also supported athletics. More recently, the Bank of Scotland Foundation has provided financial support to charities across Scotland, helping local services and individuals in many communities. This side of the bank's work reminds us that large institutions often play more than one role in society. Of course, a bank is a business, and its main purpose is to provide financial services. But banks also influence public life through sponsorship, charity, and community support. In Scotland, where the Bank of Scotland has such a long history, that broader role is especially visible. It means that the bank is known not only through branches, accounts, cards, and notes, but also through practical involvement in local life. That can strengthen public recognition and help maintain a sense that the institution remains connected to the people and places whose trust supported it over many generations. So what makes the Bank of Scotland distinctive? Part of the answer is its age. Very few institutions can trace their history back to the 17th century and still remain active today. But age by itself is not enough. The more interesting answer is that the bank has combined continuity with change. It was founded in 1695, yet it adopted the telegraph, introduced centralized computing, launched mobile banks, developed early cash machines, pioneered home banking, expanded internationally, and adapted to mergers and modern regulation. At the same time, it kept some key defining features, especially its Scottish identity and its right to issue banknotes. That combination is rare. Some institutions are old but resist change. Others accept change but lose their identity. The Bank of Scotland has managed, with different results in different periods, to do both. That is why it remains such a useful example when we think about banking history. It shows that a long-lived institution must be trusted, but it must also keep moving. Survival over centuries is never passive. It requires constant adjustment and renewal. So, in conclusion, the Bank of Scotland is much more than an old bank with a famous name. It was created to support Scottish trade and economic stability at a time of uncertainty. It became a pioneer in paper money, helped shape the Scottish banking system, expanded across the country, adopted new technologies early, and later became part of one of the largest banking groups in the United Kingdom. Yet despite all these changes, it still remains closely associated with Scotland, with Edinburgh, and with a long tradition of financial innovation. That is what makes its history so interesting. It is a story of endurance, adaptation, and public importance. The Bank of Scotland has changed many times, but it has never fully lost the character that made it important in the first place. When we study it, we see how banking can reflect wider history, including trade, technology, law, politics, and identity. In that sense, the story of the Bank of Scotland is not only about finance. It is also about how a country builds institutions that last.